Kia ora, this is Liz. Welcome to Dames Ablaze. If you have not watched my intro video yet, can I suggest you do that now so that you know what's going on? Otherwise, grab your Bible and we'll dig on in. This morning we are looking at John chapter 5 and verses 19 to 21, which I will read for you now. Then Jesus answered and said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, the Son also does, in like manner. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all the things that he himself does. And he will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. For as the Father raised the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will." Now, I always had this idea in my head that the Pharisees immediately left in verse 18, right, where John tells you that they sought all the more to kill him. But I don't think they did leave anymore. They stick around. And Jesus goes on to elaborate his previous statement. So if we run verses 17 and 19 together without verse 18 in the way, we get this. "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working. Most assuredly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, the Son also does in like manner." Makes more sense now. Far from calming the Jews down, what Jesus is about to do is going to make things infinitely worse, because he's going to explain what work he's doing, and there are two main aspects of it that are really going to set the elite on fire. This is basically his testimony. They came to him to seek an explanation for his Sabbath breaking. What they get is a testimony of who he is and why it's therefore appropriate for him to be doing good works on the Sabbath. The two aspects of his work that Jesus is about to focus on are raising the dead and judgment. We're obviously focusing on the first of these this week. We'll get to judgment next week. I've split them up because I feared the lesson would end up being way too long if I did both together. So these two actions, amongst all the other healings and restorations that Jesus has done and will do, are the two key pointers that show Jesus' authority was not just from heaven, but being directed by heaven. The accusation before us is that of blasphemy, if you remember, and the proof that the Jews believe they have is in the statement that Jesus made, "My Father." They saw that statement as Jesus making himself equal with God and therefore committing blasphemy. However, if Jesus is being directed by heaven, it can hardly be called blasphemy. Now, I probably should have covered this last week, but I didn't come across anything mentioning it till this week. So let's take a look at what blasphemy actually means to the Jews. And we are going to be diving into some Greek words here, which I will probably not be pronouncing right. And I apologize to that. If you are a Greek speaker, I'm very, very sorry for what I'm about to do to your language. So the Greeks saw blasphemy much as we do, which means using your words to discredit or run someone down, particularly God. But to the Hebrew mind, blasphemy can also include actions. For instance, the building of the golden calf was described as just one of the many blasphemous acts by the Israelites during their time in the wilderness by Nehemiah. So, in the Old Testament, there are 5 Hebrew words used to form the Hebrew idea of what blasphemy is. And here we go with my terrible pronunciation of ancient Hebrew rather than Greek, sorry, Hebrew. So, borak, this word means to bless someone, particularly by taking the knee, which doesn't sound much like blasphemy, right? But it's used in the opposite vein 7 times in the Old Testament, twice in the book of 1 Kings, during Jezebel's plot to have Naboth killed, twice in the first chapter of Job, once by Job describing his children's possible sin against God, and once by the Satan who claims Job will curse or borok God to his face if he allows the Satan to harass him. Twice in the second chapter of Job, once again by the Satan and then by his wife. Now, it's possible that his wife actually didn't use it in the opposite sense. Most translations have her saying, "Curse God and die." But perhaps we have been unfair. Perhaps she actually said, "Bless God and die." Doesn't sound as good, but it could be. 3 modern translations use the word bless instead of curse. So, it's possible. I would point out that it seems unreasonable of Job to reply to her that she's speaking as a foolish woman if she had said bless. It is a more reasonable response to the word curse. The last time we see borok used in the antithetical sense, or that would be the opposite sense, is in Psalm 10:3. But here again, it could be blessed or cursed, depending on which way around you place the words. So it's a little slippery then. But when it's used in the cursing sense, it is about words generally, though Job's concern was for the actions of his children. Gordaf is the next word the Hebrews use. It means to revile or blaspheme literally. It's used to describe the words of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, and his words against Yahweh. In the books of Ezekiel and Numbers, it is describing actions as well as words. So I'll just read you a bit from Ezekiel. Therefore, Son of Man, speak to the house of Israel and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, in this too your fathers have blasphemed, that is Gordaf. They have blasphemed me by being unfaithful to me. In what way were they like that? Well, when I brought them into the land concerning which I had raised my hand in an oath to give them, and they saw all the high hills and all the thick trees, there they offered their sacrifices and provoked me with their offerings. They also sent up their sweet aroma and poured out their drink offerings. Just a note, that was not to Yahweh, that was to whatever god they felt like giving it to at the time. The blasphemy here is obviously about actions, right? In particular in their worship of other gods, as I said. So moving on to the other two words translated as blasphemy, we have koraf, meaning to expose as by stripping, which can be translated betroth, but more figuratively it means to defame, defile, rail against, bring a reproach, or upbraid someone. So stripping someone of their dignity and honour, right? The fourth word, is nokab, which literally means to pierce. So this again is about words. But these words are designed to do damage to another person, to pierce them through with your words, and it can relate to words spoken against God. The fifth and most prevalent word used is neotso. Butchered that one. Its main definition is contempt. It's used to describe David's actions with Bathsheba and the Israelites' actions throughout the wilderness years, including the sin with the golden calf. It also means to spurn or despise. As you can see, to the Hebrews, to blaspheme means more than just using Jesus' name as a swear word. It's an attitude toward God, a contemptuous, arrogant attitude that says, I am greater than the one who made me. Just a note, if you wanted to catch up with some of those stories that I have described in there, all of the Bible quotes are down there in the description. You can follow them for yourself and have a good look. Anyway, all of this brings us back to the actions of Jesus. Does Jesus show contempt for God when he heals on the Sabbath? Is he committing blasphemy in saying his Father? Because those are the two charges in front of us, right? And I don't think he did, but I'll leave you guys to decide for yourself. It's worth you having a ponder and a think and going for a long walk and just thinking about, did Jesus actually commit blasphemy in saying my Father? Back to verse 18 then. Most assuredly I say to you. So this statement always precedes a solemn word by Jesus, right? We've met it before, and I've explained it a number of times, so I won't do it again. Our modern take on it would be something like, listen up, this is really important. Most assuredly, listen up. What I'm about to say to you is really important. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he sees the Father do. Far from denying that he has made himself equal with God, Jesus appears to agree with them and even add to his blasphemy. Look, if he was not who he said he was, then he would most certainly have been guilty of this particular sin. What follows is his proof of identity, testimony, right? And he starts by stating that he doesn't do anything of himself, that everything he does because he sees the Father doing it. Notice that these are all present tense terms. It's not what he has seen, but what he sees. It's not what God has been doing, it's what he is doing. God is doing things, even there in the midst of those Jews and their offended beings. God is still present in Israel, even though they hadn't actually heard from him in many a century. And I'm not just talking about Jesus being present, I'm talking about God the Father being present. He is still there. He is still working. He's still watching, still being blasphemed against by the Jews' behavior. Jesus does nothing unless God has already done it or is doing it. He is fully obedient to the call the Father has given him. He was sent to save the lost, heal the broken, set the captives free, amongst lots of other stuff, by freeing the man from his infirmity. Please don't lose sight of the paralytic man who started this whole thing, right? By freeing him from his infirmity, he did all three of those things. He saved the lost, he healed the broken, and he set that captive free. Whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. So to do something likewise is to do it in like manner, to do it similarly, in the same way, or equally. So Jesus does nothing that the Lord wouldn't do. Everything Jesus does, God the Father approves of and would do. Like father, like son is the phrase we would typically use. Just as Jesus learned to be a carpenter by following Joseph around and watching what he did, he also followed the Father around watching how he does things, which means in essence that healing the man on the Sabbath was in fact something Yahweh would do. Quite right, I would say. Of course God would heal on the Sabbath. Why not? It's hardly work to an infinitely powerful God, now is it? When you think about it, when you consider that everything Jesus did was exactly what the Father would do, it spins your head a little. What does Jesus do? He heals the sick, the blind, etc. But he also clears the temple, challenges the Pharisees' understanding of the scriptures, calls Herod that fox, and even calls Peter out for his pride. Does this perhaps put God in a slightly different light to the vision you've always had of him? I think some modern Christians, have a little too soft a view of God. We've lived with his mercy for so long that we often forget the other side of that coin, judgment. God is merciful, but he's also just. And in order to be just, justice needs to be done. Sometimes to produce justice, someone must pay. That, after all, is what the crucifixion of Jesus is all about. A debt needed to be paid, and Jesus paid it, even though it wasn't his debt. But it needed to happen for God to be just and for justice to prevail. God is also honest. He doesn't lie. And so when someone comes up to Jesus and asks, "What must I do to be saved?" Jesus is kind of blunt. Sell all you have and give it to the poor. It's quite an answer, really, isn't it? God is kind and he is love, but you know what? Love speaks the truth at all times, and that's not always comfortable to hear. To do nothing that God wouldn't do is to indicate the union between the Father and the Son. They are in such concert that Jesus knows to his bones at any moment how the Father would act, down to the very words he would use and the tone he would say them in. Imagine being that tight with God. The only moment where it appears that union was broken was on the cross. And Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Many people say that that's when God turned his face away from Jesus. In fact, there are songs about that, right? So that's what we think is happening. What's actually happening is that Jesus is recalling to the minds of those listening Psalm 22, a song that David wrote, which, if you look at it, will recall to you many of the things that happened while Jesus was on the cross. I am no longer convinced the union was broken at that point or at any point. I do believe Jesus still had enough presence of mind to remind everyone why he was there and that it had been foretold. The Son can do nothing independently of the Father. He's not like human sons who deliberately go out of their way to reject the faith of their fathers, to reject their teaching and do anything to show that they are separate individuals. Jesus has no desire and no need to separate himself or his actions from the Father's will. They are in complete harmony. That's what makes them one. Just saying. As the Bengel's Gnomen put it, the Father at once showeth and doeth, and the Son seeth and doeth. Great little bit of Old English there. For Jesus to be guilty of blasphemy, he would have to be acting in disharmony with God. He would have to be rebelling against God. There is nothing in his action here with the man by the Pool of Bethesda or anywhere during his 3.5, give or take, year mission that was of that ilk. There was no hint of rebellion in Jesus. He was as the Father is. And why is that? Well, because the Father loves the Son. That's what Jesus tells you. The love mentioned here is phileo, which puzzled me. I have to say I was expecting agape, but when I consider that agape is sacrificial love, it does make more sense that God the Father has phileo, or brotherly affection and kindness toward the Son. The Son sacrifices for mankind. That is where the agape love of God is to be found. Between the three persons of the Godhead, there is phileo. To show phileo love is to show warm affection and intimate friendship. It's characterized by a tender, heartfelt consideration for the other. It is a sense of true kinship that transcends actual family ties. It's actually a deeper form of love than I had previously considered it to be. And it certainly makes more sense as the kind of love between the three aspects of the Godhead, or the three persons of the Godhead, rather. The Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does. This is fairly obvious, although Jesus as a manifest human only shows up in this short period of history. As part of the Godhead, Jesus has been around since the beginning and has been party to all that went on throughout history. The Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does, and he will show him greater works than these. To show something is to exhibit it, demonstrate it, point it out, or make it known. More than has already been shown is going to be shown. You get that, right? That might leave us wondering, well, what could that possibly be? Jesus has already done some pretty impressive things by the time we get to this healing of the paralytic. He's turned water to wine, which was pretty cool. Done a number of healings already. What else could be coming? Well, there's walking on water, feeding masses of people, curing leprosy. I could go on and rattle them all off, but Jesus does in fact tell us what to him are at least the two main works that are going to be shown. But first he tells you why these greater works will be happening. It's so that they may marvel. They would be us, right? Interesting? Yes? The word they is specific to the people Jesus is talking to, but it works equally for all of us who look on the things that he did and marvel at them. To marvel is to be struck with wonder, to be astonished out of our senses, to wonder greatly. There is a suggestion that the wondering is related to beginning to speculate about the things we find wonderful. In other words, it means our brain is getting attached to what is shocking us and we're starting to think about it. The miracles of Jesus had all of this in mind, right? They were meant to make men think, to consider, to stand in awe even, to make us sit up, take notice, and realize that God is in the midst doing amazing things. It's not the feeling that it conjured up in the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but that was its design and its purpose. These were signs pointing to the truth of Jesus' identity, designed to produce honor toward the Son, as we are told, and we'll get to next week in verse 23. Jesus is about to elaborate on the two greater works that are obviously shout to the heavens kind of signs, the ones that the Jews refused to believe, and worse, then they attributed them to the Satan, a blasphemy of the Holy Spirit that is not really forgivable. The first of the greater works that Jesus will tackle here is raising the dead. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. Now there is a debate about whether this refers to the spiritually dead or the physically dead, and there are good points to be found on both sides of that particular coin. The word dead is nekros. Now some of you may be familiar with that word and the derivatives of it, necromancy for instance. It literally means what lacks life. It can also refer to that which is not able to respond to impulse or perform functions, something that is powerless or inoperative, like a computer perhaps, which seems to be alive but isn't really. To give life is a word I am not even going to venture to pronounce. It means to make alive, quicken, animate, or figuratively speaking, to empower with divine life. It is often used in the scriptures to refer to God, infusing his life into a believer to empower them and give them the ability to overcome sin. So both of these words then can refer to either literal life and death or spiritual life and death. However, in the context that Jesus is speaking here in John 5, my personal feeling is that he is speaking of the actual dead. When we're around a new convert, perhaps someone who's been a right scumbag, their conversion will produce in us a desire to celebrate, but it wouldn't normally produce awe and wonder. However, if I were at a funeral and the corpse got up and walked out, that would certainly produce awe and wonder. If the greater works are about stirring that sense of awe, I feel it needs to be something that does in fact inspire awe, which would seem to point this act more toward the rising of the literal dead than the spiritual dead. But do note that there are elements of both in here. There must be, because he goes on to speak of judgment and even brings into view in verses 28 and 29 final judgment. That would tend more to the spiritual side of life than the physical. But I don't think we should look at this as only about the spiritual side of life. So then, is there evidence of God raising the literal dead in the Old Testament? Sure. There are in fact 3 instances of the dead being raised, once by Elijah, once by Elisha, and one fallen soldier who came back to life after his body touched the bones of Elisha. So technically twice for Elisha then. The first 2 were effected by human effort. Elijah prayed for the dead child, stretched himself over him 3 times, and then cried out to the Lord, whereupon the child rose. Elisha lay on top of the dead child, and breathed life back into him. The third is frankly just awe-inspiring. When we compare these resurrections with how Jesus did it, we see some serious similarities, which I'll get to shortly, but some remarkable differences. And ease, right? There's no drama, no need to stretch himself upon the dead, just an instruction to the dead, which the dead obey. This can easily be attributed to the fact that Jesus was also God and therefore needed only to speak to them to see them raised, right? Jesus also raised 3 literal dead people. A young man just outside the town of Nain, Jairus' daughter, and of course Lazarus. Of these 3, the healing at Nain caused wonder, or actually fear, in the people. Can I just point out the similarities here? Jesus raised 3 people. There are 3 people in the Old Testament, 2 sons, and the first 2 that Jesus resurrected were also children of parents, made specifically. And the third one in the Old Testament was a man who was thrown in a tomb and came back alive, and the third one in the New Testament is Lazarus, who came out of the tomb alive. So there are some serious links there. So anyway, the the healing at Nain caused wonder and actually fear in the people. Jairus' daughter was healed in relative obscurity, but her parents reacted with astonishment, which that word means to be put out of place or be beside oneself, completely stupefied or at a total loss to explain or account for something. So they certainly fitted the bill of marveling at the works that Jesus did for them. Lazarus' resurrection, of course, which was very public, so public in fact that it forced Jesus into obscurity for the remaining 6 months before the crucifixion. The reaction to his resurrection was that everyone finally believed who Jesus was, except for the religious elite, who became seriously concerned when the news got back to them. You can check that all out in John 11:45-50. Of course, the biggest and most obvious awe-inspiring greater work than God was his own resurrection. And it did inspire wonder and amazement in people. Not again in the Pharisees. They just paid for the soldiers who were guarding the tomb to lie about the disciples stealing the body. Anyway, even so, back to our text. Even so, the Son gives life to whom he will. Interesting phrasing here. He will is theolo, meaning to desire, wish, or will, wanting what is best or optimal because someone is ready and willing to act. Jesus is willing to give life back to people, but they must be willing to accept it. This is where spiritual death and life comes in, right? Here where Jesus extends life to all, but only those who accept it ultimately receive it. That makes sense, right? I mean, if you're offered a drink of water and you choose not to drink it, then it's your fault if you die of thirst, not the fault of the one who offered you the glass of water. Jesus offers life to all. It's extended to all through all time since his death and resurrection. What do we do with that then? Well, if you're a Christian, you've accepted his life. But how do we use our conversion to produce awe and wonder in others? We don't necessarily have an amazing testimony of being dead for 4 days and then resurrected. So how do we use our own new life to inspire, at the very least, interest in hearing more about Jesus? We all have a testimony, and if you will consider it, think about it, pray about it, practice it even, I think you and God will find a way to weave your testimony into something that does inspire, perhaps not the full amazement and awe that a revived corpse would, but still enough to whet the appetite of your listener. You can also work on your own take on who Jesus was and what he did. What are the things that Jesus did that inspire you? What aspects of his character make you feel awe? Those can also be part of your testimony because they are an evidence and a proof that no one can actually dispute. So go this week, do some rehearsing of your own testimony. You never know when you might need it. That is all I have for you this week. May you and your household be blessed, and I will see you next week. Ka kite anō.